The last thing the dying man remembered was a stranger's voice telling him, "Stay with me. Help is coming." He was lying alone on a dark highway, injured, freezing, and moments away from losing consciousness. The person who found him had no idea who he was. He didn't know his past, his secrets, or the reason someone had left him there that night. He only saw a human being in need, and he chose to stop. That single decision saved a life. But what happened years later would leave him questioning everything about that night. Because the man he rescued wasn't just a stranger. He was someone whose identity had been hidden for years, someone connected to a story that was far bigger than either of them could have imagined. For years, Daniel Carter believed he had simply helped a man survive one terrible night. He never expected a phone call years later that would bring the past rushing back. He never expected to discover who that stranger truly was. And he never expected to learn that the few minutes he spent helping someone on a lonely highway had changed two lives forever. This is the story of a chance encounter, a hidden identity, and the shocking truth behind the stranger Daniel Carter saved. Years before that unforgettable night, Daniel Carter was living a quiet and ordinary life in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio. He was the kind of person most people overlooked. He was not a celebrity. He was not someone who made headlines. He was simply a hard-working man who believed that the world became a better place when ordinary people chose to do the right thing. Daniel worked long hours, took care of his family, and spent most of his free time helping the people around him. His neighbors knew him as the person who would show up when someone needed a hand. If an elderly neighbor needed help fixing something around the house, Daniel was there. If someone's car broke down on the side of the road, Daniel was the person who would stop. He never thought of these moments as anything special. To him, helping someone was simply what people were supposed to do. But sometimes, the smallest decisions create the biggest changes. And Daniel was about to discover that one ordinary night would become the moment that connected his life to a stranger he would never forget. It happened during a stormy night in November. The rain had been falling heavily for hours, covering the highway in a thick layer of darkness. Most drivers had already left the road. The highways were nearly empty. Daniel was heading home after a long day at work, thinking only about getting back to his family. He had no reason to believe that anything unusual was waiting for him, until he saw the vehicle, a damaged SUV sitting alone on the shoulder of the road. At first, Daniel slowed down but kept driving. After all, there were plenty of reasons a car could be stopped. Maybe someone was waiting for help. Maybe they had already called for assistance. But something made Daniel look back. Something about that empty road didn't feel right. He turned his vehicle around and drove back. As he approached the SUV, he noticed the driver's door was open. The headlights were still on. And then he saw him, a man lying several feet away from the vehicle, motionless. For a moment, Daniel froze. His first thought was that he was too late. But then he saw movement. The man was alive. Barely. Daniel immediately rushed toward him. The stranger's face was pale. His breathing was weak. He looked like someone who had been through something terrible. Daniel called emergency services and stayed beside him. But before the stranger lost consciousness, he grabbed Daniel's arm and whispered words that Daniel would remember for years. "Don't let them find me." Daniel didn't understand. Who was them? Why was this injured man afraid? And what had happened before Daniel arrived? Those questions stayed unanswered as the ambulance arrived and rushed the stranger to the hospital. Daniel thought he would eventually learn the truth. But after that night, the stranger disappeared. No explanation. No message. No thank you. Nothing. For years, Daniel wondered what happened to the man he saved. He assumed maybe the stranger moved away. Maybe he wanted to forget that night. Maybe their paths were never meant to cross again. But Daniel was wrong. Because the stranger had not forgotten him. And years later, when their lives crossed again, Daniel would finally discover why that man had been running that night. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. For years, Daniel Carter tried to forget that night. Life moved forward. The memory of the injured stranger became one of those strange moments people carry with them. A story they occasionally tell, but never expect to become important. Daniel returned to his normal routine. Work, family, the simple responsibilities of everyday life. The highway incident slowly became a distant memory. But somewhere else, far away from Daniel's quiet town, another person was carrying the weight of that night. The stranger Daniel saved was not living an ordinary life. And the reason he had been afraid that night was connected to a past he had spent years trying to escape. His name was Thomas Reed. At least, that was the name Daniel knew. For a long time, Daniel believed Thomas was just a man who found himself in a terrible situation. He never imagined that the name Thomas Reed was only part of the story, because behind that identity was a hidden past. A past filled with unanswered questions, lost relationships, and secrets that had never been fully explained. The truth was that Thomas had spent years running from something that happened long before he met Daniel. Something that changed the direction of his entire life. Something that made him believe he could never go back. But Daniel's decision to stop on that highway created a moment Thomas never expected. A moment that reminded him there were still people willing to help without asking for anything in return. And that kindness would eventually lead him back to the man who saved him. Years passed. Daniel grew older. His children became adults. The world around him changed. But one thing never changed. He still remembered the stranger's final words before the ambulance arrived. "Don't let them find me." Sometimes, late at night, Daniel wondered what those words meant. Was Thomas in danger? Was someone chasing him? Was he involved in something serious? Or was he simply a frightened man who had been through a traumatic experience? Daniel never found out. Until one morning, years later, when he received a letter. There was nothing unusual about the envelope. No warning. No explanation. Just his name written across the front. Daniel almost ignored it. He received plenty of mail every day. Bills. Advertisements. Letters from companies he barely remembered. But something about this one felt different. When he opened it, a photograph fell onto the table. Daniel picked it up and immediately recognized the face. It was Thomas, the man from the highway. But underneath the photograph was a message that made Daniel stop breathing for a moment. "Thank you for giving me another chance at life." Daniel read the words again, then again, because after all these years, the stranger he had saved had finally returned. But the letter raised more questions than answers. Why had Thomas waited so long? Why did he disappear after being rescued? And what was the truth behind the identity he had hidden? The letter contained an invitation, a meeting, one final conversation. Daniel had spent years wondering what happened to Thomas Reed. Now he finally had a chance to find out. But he had no idea that meeting Thomas again would reveal a secret that would change the way he remembered everything. When Daniel arrived at the meeting location, he barely recognized the man standing in front of him. Thomas was older. His hair had turned gray. His face carried the signs of years filled with struggles and difficult decisions. But his eyes were the same eyes Daniel saw on that highway years earlier. For a few moments, neither man spoke. Because sometimes, after years of silence, there are no easy words. Finally, Thomas looked at Daniel and said something that Daniel never expected to hear. "I have wanted to find you for a very long time." Daniel asked the question that had stayed with him for years. "Who were you really?" Thomas looked down, and for the first time, Daniel saw something he had not seen before. Regret. Thomas explained that the name Daniel knew was not his real story. Years earlier, Thomas had been involved in a situation that forced him to walk away from his old life. He had lost contact with people he loved. He had hidden parts of himself because he believed the truth would only bring more pain. But the night Daniel found him changed everything. Because that night was the first time in years someone helped him without knowing his past. Without judging him. Without expecting anything in return. Daniel had treated him like a human being when Thomas felt like he had lost everything. And that was something Thomas never forgot. But there was still one question Daniel needed answered. Why did Thomas say, "Don't let them find me"? Thomas took a deep breath. Then he revealed the truth. The people he feared were not strangers chasing him. They were people connected to a painful chapter of his past. A chapter involving a decision he made years earlier. A decision that forced him to disappear. And the reason he was on that highway that night was because he was finally trying to return and face the life he had left behind. But before he could do that, everything went wrong, and Daniel became the unexpected person who stood between him and losing his life. What Daniel did not know was that saving Thomas that night would eventually help uncover a truth that had remained hidden for decades. A truth that would finally bring answers to a family that had been waiting for them. And as Thomas continued explaining what happened, Daniel realized something. The stranger he saved was not only carrying a secret. He was carrying a story that had been waiting years to be told. Thomas sat quietly for a moment before continuing his story. For years, He had carried the burden of a decision he made when he was younger, a decision that changed his relationship with the people closest to him. He explained that before the night Daniel found him on the highway, he had spent years searching for answers about his own past. He had discovered information about his family that had been hidden from him for decades, a truth about his identity, a truth about where he came from, and a truth that forced him to confront everything he thought he knew. Thomas revealed that he had grown up believing one version of his life. But as he got older, he discovered there were missing pieces, documents that did not match, stories that changed depending on who told them, questions that nobody wanted to answer. The more he searched, the more he realized that the people around him had protected a secret for years, not because they wanted to hurt him, but because they believed hiding the truth would protect everyone involved. Thomas spent years trying to understand why. Why had people kept such an important part of his life hidden? Why had he been denied the chance to know the full story? And why did the truth only come out after so many years? But searching for answers came with a cost. The more he uncovered, the more complicated his life became. Old relationships were tested. People he trusted disappeared. And eventually, Thomas found himself alone, carrying information that changed everything. That was the reason he was on that highway. He was on his way to meet someone connected to his past, someone who had the answers he had spent years looking for. But before he could reach that person, his car was forced off the road. The accident left him injured and helpless. And that was when Daniel appeared. At that moment, Thomas believed his search for the truth might end there. But then a stranger stopped. A man who had no reason to care. A man who knew nothing about him. A man who simply saw someone in trouble and decided to help. Thomas told Daniel something that stayed with him. Everyone else wanted to know my story before they helped me. You helped me before you knew anything. Those words affected Daniel deeply, because that was exactly what he had always believed. A person's worth should never depend on their past. But there was still one final piece of the story. The reason Thomas had returned after all those years. The reason he wanted Daniel to know the truth. Thomas reached into his bag and pulled out an old envelope. Inside were photographs, documents, and a handwritten letter. Daniel recognized something immediately. The handwriting. It was from the small note Thomas had left behind at the hospital years earlier. But this time, there was something else. A name. A connection. A person Daniel never expected to be part of the story. Thomas explained that after leaving the hospital, he spent years trying to rebuild his life. But one thing remained impossible to ignore. He needed to find the person who helped him survive that night. Because without Daniel's decision, the truth he uncovered might have never been discovered. Daniel learned that the information Thomas found eventually helped reconnect a broken family. People who had spent years believing they had lost someone forever. A misunderstanding that lasted decades was finally corrected. And a secret that had separated people was finally brought into the light. The man Daniel thought he had only saved physically had actually been saved in another way. That night on the highway had given Thomas the strength to keep searching, to keep asking questions, and to keep believing that the truth was worth finding. Years later, Daniel finally understood why their paths crossed. It was not about a reward. It was not about recognition. It was about one moment when one person chose to care about another. A moment that created a chain reaction neither man could have predicted. Looking back, Daniel realized something powerful. Most people never know the impact they have on others. A kind word, a helping hand, a few minutes spent making a difference. Sometimes those small choices become the moments people remember for the rest of their lives. The stranger on the highway had entered Daniel's life for only a few minutes. But those few minutes changed everything. And for Thomas, Daniel was not just the person who saved his life. He was the person who reminded him that even during the darkest moments, there were still people willing to help. Years after that first encounter, the two men stayed in contact. Their lives had taken different paths, but they shared a connection that few people experience. A connection created by a single decision. The decision to stop. The decision to help. The decision to care. Because sometimes, the people who enter our lives by accident are the ones who leave the biggest mark. And sometimes, the stranger standing in front of us today may be connected to a story we will only understand years later. So the question is, if you were driving down that empty highway on that rainy night, and you saw someone who needed help, would you have stopped? Would you have taken the risk without knowing who they were? Would you have helped a stranger without expecting anything in return? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story of kindness, mystery, and unexpected connections, Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our upcoming stories. Because sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest stories.